Hello everyone, my name is Justin, and this is Who Is Like You Ministries. This video is about Jesus' trial before the crucifixion and who was in attendance. I would venture to guess that most Christians would say that the groups present were the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Jewish populace, Roman soldiers, and maybe a Gentile citizen or two. But what if I told you that that may not be the case? Before we examine the trial, it is important to know what groups of Jews were around during the Second Temple period. These groups were the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. I will give a brief overview of each group just so everyone is familiar with them. First, we'll discuss the Pharisees. I do want to emphasize that none of the four groups are inherently evil, especially the Pharisees, who are the most negatively framed by many Christians. They are also probably the most famous group of the four. These men were experts in both the oral law, which is often referred to as the tradition of the elders or just tradition, in books like Mark 7:3 or Matthew 15:3, and the written law. The oral Torah was handed down to Moses by God at the same time he was given the written Torah. In this video, I won't go into detail about the oral law, but it is still held in as high esteem and is as binding as the written law by modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. The written law is the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, but can also mean the entire Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. In the Mishnah, the rabbis write in Pirkei Avot 1:1 that Moses received the Torah, which is taken to mean the written and oral, at Sinai, and it was handed down to Joshua, then to the elders, then the prophets, and then to the men of the great assembly. This is the basis for the tradition of the elders. They also focused on ritual purity and desired for Jewish people to be holy as God commanded them in Leviticus 11, 19, and 20. The two most famous biblical Pharisees were the Apostle Paul and Gamaliel. Gamaliel is one of the most renowned teachers in all of Judaism. He wrote much of the Mishnah, or at least his words were recorded. According to Rabbi Blumoff, the Pharisees are also ancestors of all modern-day Jews. Jesus was most closely related to the Pharisees in belief and practice than the other groups. Next are the Sadducees. Not much is known about this group as they disappeared. We do know that they are the priestly, aristocratic class who oversaw the temple and its services and claimed to be descendants of Zadok, the high priest of Solomon. They were extremely political and were very much concerned with holding on to their power. Only the Pentateuch was authoritative for them, and they rejected the oral law. They also did not believe in life after death and rejected the resurrection of the dead, according to Matthew 22:23 and Luke 20:27. The Essenes are the third group, and for many scholars, the last of the major Jewish groups. They believed that they were the true people of God, and only they were correctly following God's will. This is the group that are thought to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls. They mostly dwelt in the desert region of Qumran, although some lived in a community in Jerusalem. While the Pharisees associated with all Jews, the Essenes only associated with each other, and there was a rigorous process to become one of them. This group is not mentioned in the Bible by name, although they are written about in Philo and Josephus. Some scholars believe that John the Baptist was an Essene, though this is debated. The Essenes were actually stricter regarding Torah observance than the Pharisees. There are passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls where the Essenes insult the Pharisees, calling them, quote, seekers after smooth things. The last main group of Jews are the Zealots. They were the extreme side of the Pharisees and refused to pay taxes to Caesar, claiming only God was king over them. Simon, one of Jesus' disciples, was referred to as a zealot, but it is unclear if he was part of this group or just zealous for God. This was a very violent group and was ultimately crushed by the Romans. So what do the Gospels say about Jesus' arrest and trial? In Mark 14:43, Mark tells us that Judas arrived with the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders to arrest Jesus. Matthew corroborates this in 26:47, writing that Judas arrived with the chief priests and the elders of the people. Luke agrees as well in 22:52, recording that the chief priests, officers of the temple, and elders were with Judas. John also writes a very similar passage in 18:3. Jesus is then led to his trial, And we come to the part of the story where we are told by the Gospels that the crowd wished for his death so much that they released Barabbas, a murderer, just to have Jesus crucified. This brings up very interesting questions. Why couldn't Jesus' disciples stay awake in Gethsemane despite Jesus pleading with them to pray with him? Why also were the Jewish people so enamored with Jesus when he triumphantly rode into Jerusalem in Mark 11, Matthew 21, Luke 19, and John 12, but all of a sudden the crowd is now screaming for him to be put to death? The religious leaders definitely felt threatened by Jesus' popularity, but it is very unlikely that they could persuade the people that quickly to hate him, especially when there are events earlier in the Gospels where the leaders are afraid to arrest him because they didn't want to get killed by an angry crowd. It doesn't add up. To fully understand this question, we need to look at what time of year it is and when Jesus was arrested and crucified. As it reads in all of the Gospels, there is some dispute with John on the day of Jesus' arrest, but we won't get into that here. Jesus came to Jerusalem to celebrate Pesach, the Passover, the most important celebration of the year, complete with eating, drinking, merrymaking, and praising God for rescuing their ancestors from Egypt. When Jesus led them to Gethsemane, why couldn't Peter, James, and John stay awake for just 1 hour? The answer lies in the celebration itself. Traditional Passover celebrations involved huge feasts and 4 cups of wine. The meal started at sundown and ended at midnight. Another thing to consider is that Jesus and his disciples were also extremely exhausted from several days of travel and preparation. As I mentioned earlier, the religious leaders feared arresting Jesus in the daytime out of fear of the crowds, so the perfect time to do it would have been in the late hours of the night, after midnight. It is a perfect plan. All of Jesus' disciples and followers would have been in bed by that time and unable to stop the soldiers. We know the trial took place in the early morning because the rooster would have crowed for Peter's denial at around 5 in the morning, and Mark writes in 15:1 that the sentence was given at sunrise. What group of people would have been around this early after the Passover feasts? Most likely it would have been the corrupt priests and Roman soldiers, all wanting to kill Jesus. Even more than that, Jesus was crucified at 9 in the morning according to Mark 15:25. At this time, the first temple service of the day was held. The daily services and times were set by Ezra the scribe and the 120 men of the Great Assembly. There were 3 daily worship services, morning, afternoon, and evening. Jesus' accusers knew they had to finish the trial before the crowds re-entered Jerusalem to come and worship for the morning service. As they entered the city, there Jesus was, carrying the cross out of town on his way to his death. This is why there is a sudden weeping from Jesus' followers, starting in Luke 23:27. They had no idea what was happening. To answer my initial question of who was at Jesus' trial, the Sadducees, scribes, elders, and Roman soldiers were. Most of the Jewish population had no clue what was going on, and according to the text, the Pharisees, the group pictured as being the most evil or corrupt, weren't even there. We know that the scribes, while extremely versed in the law, just as the Pharisees were a different group. There are numerous times in the Gospels where a differentiation is made between the Pharisees and the scribes. There are a few occasions where some of the scribes are Pharisees, but it always reads, quote, the scribes of the Pharisees. And in Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, no such distinction is made. What can we conclude from this? The time of the Passover was a great celebration filled with feasts, drinking, and praise. The Jewish people would have celebrated from sundown to midnight, and then went to sleep until the next morning when they would get up to worship at the temple. Jesus, along with his extremely exhausted disciples, go to the garden at Gethsemane to pray, but because of their overtiredness, the disciples kept falling asleep. Judas then shows up in the wee hours of the morning with the chief priests, scribes, and the elders of the people to arrest Jesus and to rush the trial before any of his followers could realize what was happening. The Jewish people arrive in the morning to worship at the temple, only to find that Jesus had been captured, convicted, and sentenced to death without them ever knowing what happened. The reason that the scriptures seem to read the bipolarism of Jesus' followers is because they weren't at the trial. This further goes to prove that it wasn't the Jews as a whole who put Jesus to death or even desired to put him to death, but the corrupt religious leaders themselves, and not even all of the religious leaders. And the Pharisees in all four Gospels are absent from the event of Jesus' capture. Who was at Jesus' arrest, trial, and conviction? The Sadducees, elders, scribes, and Romans. Thank you all for watching this video. This is a new channel that I started and will be uploading regularly on. Much of the content will include apologetic videos, theology discussions, textual interpretation, and exegesis. Thanks again for watching. This is Justin from Who Is Like You Ministries, and I'll see you in the next video.